Hey friend, in today's watercolor video, I'm going to be teaching how to paint this moody landscape inspired by the Pacific Northwest. Without further ado, let's get painting. So I'm going to be using black, Payne's gray, Perylene green, yellow ochre, VanDyke Brown, and Venetian Red by Winsor Newton. The paper size I've taped down here is a size 5 by 7 inches, and I'll be using a size 2 and a size 6 round Princeton brush and a sponge brush. We're gonna go ahead and get started with our sky first. So I'm gonna use my sponge brush, or you can use a large brush, to just do a wash of water for the first, I would say, a little over half of the page. And next, I'm gonna go ahead and take my size 6 brush, and I'm gonna use a combination of a little bit of really watered down black to get a nice soft gray with a touch of Payne's gray. So kind of like a cooler tone fog we're gonna have in our sky. So I'm just gonna start by incorporating this wash, and I'm just gonna buff it out and blend it out with some more water as needed. I wanna allow some areas to be more concentrated than others, and allowing just some of the white of the page to pop through to kind of mimic some fog in the sky. And again, I'm just working really loosely. I want some irregular shapes and edges. Really watering down that black so it's nice and soft. Here I'm just layering a second layer of that color just to give it a little bit more depth. Now I just want a slight touch more of some Payne's gray in there, so I'm just gonna layer a couple touches of that. And if your paint is not bleeding out or blending out like you want it to, and there's a hard edge, you can simply just take your brush with some clean water and go alongside that edge and blend out the harsh transition. Okay, so I've got some white and some shaded areas. I'm gonna go ahead and let the foggy sky dry, and then when we come back, we will move on to the next step. Now that the sky is dry, I'm just gonna take a good amount of Payne's gray and mix it with a little bit of black again, but I'm just doing a slightly more concentrated amount. And I wanna paint some mountain ridges here, just a couple. And it's gonna go and overlap just a touch on the sky here. So I'm going to do kind of a couple rounded triangle shapes to start, and then subtly slope it down and then back up again. From here, I'm just gonna take some water on my brush and buff out this water line, so that way I have a little bit of some shadow here and a smoother transition. And again, you just kind of want a loose, rough silhouette here, kind of mimicking some subtle triangle shapes. Then I'm just gonna smooth out this line a little bit. And while it's still wet, I want to add a little bit more detail to my mountain. So I'm gonna switch gears to my size 2 brush and just add a few touches of our mixed color. And this is just gonna give the mountain a little bit of subtle detail and variegation without it looking so flat. Okay, and that just gave the mountain a little bit of subtle texture, and it's just nice and loose. The next thing that I want to do is sketch out our pathway here, and I'm just going to use a little bit of VanDyke Brown on my size 6 brush, and I'm just going to touch here to make sure this part is dry, which it is. So if this area here, this waterline transition is dry, go ahead and do this part. And I'm just going to do a really subtle curved line, so it kind of slopes outward towards the left and comes back in. Then I'm just going to widen this pathway as it gets closer to us. So off in the distance, it's quite narrow, and then it gradually gets wider. And using my size 6 brush, I'm just going to fill this area in with water. And just a touch more of VanDyke Brown. Next, I would like to apply some color and foliage to the ground on the left and right side. I'm going to start with a watered down bit of Perylene Green. And I'm just starting this on the right side here. And it's a very muted tone of a green. And then I'm going to put just a little bit on this left corner area. And again, super loose, very irregular, loose shapes here. I do a little bit higher up as well. And maybe just a tad up here. Again, I'm doing a very loose textured shape, just tapping my brush. And then from here, I want to layer on just a little bit of some yellow ochre just to brighten some of the areas of the Perylene Green. So I'm just simply layering a little bit of that. Then from here, I'm going to take some VanDyke Brown. I'm going to just saturate this bottom right corner with some VanDyke Brown here, letting the different colors kind of mesh and bleed. I'm going to add some in this little gap as well, and a little bit up top here. And just a little in this area as well, allowing the different sections to kind of be loose and watery and bleed. Next, I want to take just some straight yellow ochre, and I'm just going to texturize some kind of like almost like dried foliage or bushes in the fall. I want some yellow ochre with lots of texture here, and it's slightly sloping upward. I'm going to add a little yellow ochre kind of bush over to the left here. And again, I'm just tapping my brush just to get this really loose, uneven texture. All right, and then I'm just going to do a touch more of yellow ochre in this kind of in-between area. And next, I want to get my Venetian Red. And I want to apply a good amount of Venetian Red in some of this white gapped area here. I'm going to add a touch of Venetian Red in this transition of the green and the yellow ochre. and just a little bit in this white area as well. I really love the color variants that we're getting here. It's super loose, but really nice kind of fall palette. All right, now I want to take a little bit more VanDyke Brown and just apply it in this white area just to fill the space. And I kind of want to slope this area upward just a little bit with that brown. And then here I just want to smooth out this kind of watery stripe here, just with a watered down brush. Just gonna kind of buff out this area just a little bit. And I want some deeper concentration of green. So I'm just gonna tap in a few elements of the Perylene Green into this brown area just to give it some texture. I'm gonna layer up a little bit more in this left corner as well. Just using the tip of my brush and kind of gently tapping. Okay, now from here, I'm actually going to be using my size 2 brush, and I want to add a little bit more texture to some of this foliage. So I'm going to use some VanDyke Brown and a little bit of Perylene Green, but I'm first going to start with the VanDyke Brown. And all I want to do is just do a few subtle vertical branches, kind of branch-like texture. Starting with this bottom right corner, I'm just doing kind of an up and down loose motion. And then I'm going to do the same thing kind of in this brown Venetian Red transition, just doing a few simple vertical dashes, super loose. And I'll do the same thing to kind of connect this yellow ochre bush here. I just want to get a little bit of this dark brown texture. I'm just subtly incorporating it into the bush. And then I'll do just a touch of this into the Venetian Red and a little bit into this yellow ochre as well. Just a little bit more detail and texture. All right, next I'm going to take some Perylene Green and add just a few touches of the Perylene Green. And I'm just going to do a few dashes of it. It's slightly more concentrated, but this is just going to give the foliage just a touch more detail. And again, I'm just incorporating it where I feel like texture is needed. So between the VanDyke Brown and the Perylene Green, that's just going to give a little bit more detail and contrast. Okay, next I want to give a little bit more detail to our pathway. So using my size 2 brush, I'm going to take a light amount of VanDyke Brown and give it a little bit of texture. So using the side of my brush and reloading my brush as needed with some more paint and water, I'm doing this kind of belly side of the brush here, laying it really flat and just moving it horizontally left to right and getting this really nice, loose, kind of dry texture just to give a little bit more detail to the pathway. And then from here, I'm going to mix a little bit of yellow ochre with some of our VanDyke Brown. And I just want to incorporate a little bit more depth on the sides, left and right of the pathway here. So I'm just giving the sides here a little bit more shading with this kind of earthier, deeper yellow ochre mixed with the VanDyke Brown. And I'm just going along the edges slightly. And then from here, I'm just going to take some straight VanDyke Brown and just add some texture, just tapping along the edges of the pathway with the tip of my size 2 brush. Okay, and now I want to focus on our pine trees. So for our pine trees, we're doing some inspired by the Pacific Northwest, and specifically in like Mount Rainier, North Cascades area, some of the pine trees are kind of tall and narrow compared to the ones we see in California. And so I'm going to start laying out our trunks just by doing some vertical lines. And I'm going to have some that are quite tall, some that are shorter. Okay, so once I have my vertical lines, I want to start to do kind of a technique where I simply just want basically some very narrow, elongated and exaggerated cone shapes. So in order to do that, I like to start, I don't know, sometimes the bottom from the top or the top to the bottom, it doesn't matter which side you start, but just starting with the bottom this time, I want to make sure the width of my trees doesn't get super, super wide at the bottom like I normally do. I really want to mimic the Washington pine trees to be more narrow like they are in my trips at the national parks that I've seen over there. They're really whimsical and tall and narrow and just really pretty. And I just love the unique quality of them being like that. It's really, really cool to see trees like that. So you could see I'm kind of following this really exaggerated shape here. The top is quite narrow. There's some dash marks on either side, and I'm just using really light pressure with the tip of my size 2 brush, mimicking a subtle cone shape, but not going overboard. So some of these trees will naturally overlap each other. Like I've got this small little guy, and that's okay. And there's going to be some gaps in between the foliage of the trees. And then I simply just cut the trees off against this subtle foliage here of the yellow ochre bush, but I'm just going to do a few taps of my brush into the foliage below each of the trees with some of this Perylene Green, so that way we can see the texture of the trees and the different gaps that the leaves have where the trees will pop through. So I'm going to go ahead and follow and mimic the same technique of just tall, narrow trees, lots of dainty dash lines on either side of the vertical lines, and mimicking an elongated, exaggerated cone shape. I'm just going to take some watered down Perylene Green, and I just want to mimic a few just vertical watered down misty pine trees here. And they're very faint, but it's almost like they're just in the faraway distance, but we can just see that there's some foliage here of the trees way off in the distance near the mountains. And then I'm just going to slope that green just a little bit to direct the path and to kind of show its cutoff point from the view of the perspective of where the viewer is standing. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me for today's Pacific Northwest inspired tutorial. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any further watercolor landscape tutorials.